The question of what is your civilian to combatant ratio has never been asked of any nation in any war in history. And there are so many. We could do a whole podcast about why. Why is it? Because the idea that you could have a casualty count in the moment, the idea that who is the person saying that was a combatant or that is a non-combatant, because in my world there's no civilians. There's either you're a part of the fight, you're a named member of an organization, or you're partaking in the fight. And there are many ways to partake in hostilities, like holding hostages, providing intelligence, bringing there's lots of reasons. But the ideal that anybody in a modern war could go point at a body and go, that was a non-combatant innocent civilian is anti basically intellectual, and that wouldn't mean just legal, moral, anything. If you have to understand the law of proportionality, like all these things, it's just never been asked because it's not the question that needs to be asked. The question is, has whatever, if we're using Israel, has Israel followed the laws of war, taken all precautions to protect civilians, like all these things? And the answer is overwhelming yes.
Hi, Culminators. Thank you once again for joining us on our adventure into thinking about what the heck's going on in this crazy world. And it has gotten crazier. And one of the people who I have consistently found useful in helping me understand the craziness, especially with respect to contemporary events involving the military, is John Spencer, known on X as Spencer Guard. John Spencer is an award-winning scholar, professor, author, combat veteran, national security and military analyst. He has written the book literally on understanding urban warfare, and to a large extent, almost all the warfare we're talking about in these days is urban warfare, one way or another. He's got so much going on. I'm going to just tell you to go to John Spencer Online bio, because don't you hate it when you go to a seminar and you pay money for the seminar and they spend 10 minutes talking about all the qualifications, and it's great for someone's, for your mom. But John, welcome to the program. Thanks so much for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me, and I agree. My statement should be the record, not necessarily what I've done in the past.
Very, very good. John, you've had apparently a really interesting career. So I want to hear in your own words. I don't know what other words you might use, but like if you would explain how you got to where you are, which I assume is something that you are passionate about and enjoy doing. It certainly seems that way, and you seem to have a very strong desire to spread the understanding that you have in public fora, which is a very long distance from going into consulting for a defense contractor, which is, obviously where the money is for former military. But what's the story? What's the John Spencer story? Where are you from in the first place?
Originally from Indiana, southeast Richmond, Indiana. Grew up pretty low income. Uh, Mom working three jobs to raise three kids. I joined the U.S. Army at the age of 17 before I even graduated high school because that's basically the only path out of. There wasn't going to be college or anything that like that for me. And I got everything that the Army says it would give me. I drank the Kool-Aid, as we say, but I got the adventure, I got the profession, education, I got college, I got character, I got service, duty, I got it all. My first duty station was Panama City, Panama. So I was thrust into the military and was in many ways reformed in the military. I served for 25 years on active duty, had an amazing career of opportunity and mentorship and just amazing, all the way up to achieving my master's at Georgetown, working in the Pentagon. At one point, I was a part of a small think tank for the top four-star of the U.S. Army, the Chief of Staff of the Army. Really, that's where my academic kind of direction started to happen. Before that, I was focused on soldiering, being the best soldier leader I could be. I had served two tours in Iraq, both as a platoon leader and a company commander. But once I got into this higher form of looking at the military, geopolitics, everything, for a year, I worked on a project for that four-star, and all he said was, "Look at you, go look at something that I'm not looking at." So I learned about research methods. I learned about how the army and military runs, from acquisitions to everything. And for a year, we looked at mega cities. So cities over 10 million people in population. There's over 30 of them around the world, but they're exponentially growing because there's such rapid urbanization and population growth around the world. Looked at mega cities for a year, finished our study, did a report. Then I moved to West Point, where I was basically teaching both military tactics, and I was actually teaching military strategy there, but also had a love for research. Helped create the Modern War Institute that I work for now at West Point, while teaching, but also getting more involved in research and understanding that there really wasn't research on wars that were going on now. One of the mentors that we had there was a former New York Times editorial board, everything. He basically taught me how to write and fell in love with writing and communicating it, because you mentioned it, which I think is a passion of mine, communicating the military complexity in a basic format, in a easily understood format. And I still to this day, trying to help people understand, because I was teaching like all those military theories of like Sun Tzu and all that stuff, and translating all that to things that are happening on the ground. I retired in 2018. I continued working with the Modern War Institute, but more as we had started developing a very unique thing, which is going into recently concluded wars or battles. I'm doing field research. We called them contemporary battlefield assessments. So I started, but I actually came out and I was writing about urban warfare. So that's where the love of urban warfare. One, I had working in the Pentagon, knew there was a gap, knew it was the future of warfare. It is the present and future of warfare. Then I became kind of this war researcher, though, where I was going into combat zones, going into Ukraine. I had a moment there where I was able to help the Ukrainians by I wrote a book on how to defend your cities based on like a decade of looking at urban warfare, successful defenses and things. Then October 7th. And so the path has been very unique and I've followed it. But you asked about the passions. Of course, I have a passion for writing. I have a passion for research because I think there's many reasons why we don't have people in the U.S. apparatus that go into active war zones. We used to do it. It used to be called combat observers. We don't do it anymore. That's a separate topic. But when you're in a field where there is no, because the purpose of like a PhD is to expand the body of knowledge, whatever study your field you're in, and you'll do this board where they say, "Are you doing something new?" Well, I fell into a category of urban warfare where, for many reasons, nobody covers it. So I was like, it's like a pot of gold in an academic study. Like, what do you mean nobody's doing this? Very few people doing it. So I just became, strongly writing about it. Then to do something after I retired that nobody else is really doing either, which is going into active zones, not as a reporter. I'm not a reporter. I'm a researcher. And to do that, and then, of course, as you know, on October 7th, I had all this information after years and years of study that was found to be very useful for people to understand what they were seeing in front of their eyes. And then it became a question of character, right? So I immediately saw, which I'm sure we'll talk about, misinformation immediately coming out. And I was the guy in the room going, oh, that's not right. And you also have to have the courage to stand up and say that. Where there's lots of people who have information, but for whatever reason, they're not willing to stand up. Those 25 years of the U.S. military, being a father now, if anything, the military gives you character, and it's the right thing to do to stand up for the truth, and that's another passion I have.
You took the words right out of my mouth because you're obviously motivated by spreading the truth because it is truth is I don't think I'm the one who made this up, the first casualty of war. As you picked up, I'm an amateur student of war, like a lot of people my age, old Cold Warriors, guys who grew up when the World War II veterans were all over the place. And the use of disinformation amplified by social media is it's mind-boggling. And well, I do want to get to that in more detail, but before we get into that, a couple of things about your career. And for example, you mentioned this focus on urban warfare, and as you described it, it occurred to me that you are building on the focus on counterinsurgency that was so big in the 80s and 90s after the terrible experiences of Vietnam, where we learned that being bigger, better, faster, and deadlier doesn't necessarily win. But Vietnam, of course, was not an urban environment at all. Quite to the contrary, it was a jungle. We nonetheless saw a counterinsurgency becoming a really relevant issue in Iraq, not a jungle, not an urban environment either. To a large extent, my amateur observation was that increasingly, notwithstanding the political and the asymmetric pressure that was put on the military toward the end of that engagement, tremendous adaptation and lessons were learned. Nonetheless, it still ends up being, I think, considered to be an unsuccessful, engagement. But where we are now is in this world of urban warfare, which Gaza in many ways, I guess, typifies. We're not moving. That's where the action is. Advanced nations don't fight each other anymore. They they have to engage in these really problematic, unromantic, and how shall I put it, unsatisfying kinds of disputes. Anything I say make any sense?
Well, it makes sense. Of course, the professor scholar in me, um, the Socratic connection of the dots, right? So you're right, Vietnam jungle warfare, although it was punctuated by like the Tet Offensive, which was all urban centric, and you had the Battle of Way that I've written the case study about. You also mentioned about the lessons that were learned. So coming out of that war, which had left a lot of scar tissue, and we could even the aspect, like you said, about social media, what's called the Cronkite effect, which was a big part of the Vietnam War. When he comes out of the Tet Offensive, just happened to be on the ground, comes back, tells a trusted, which we could get into as well as a trusted source of information, tells the world he doesn't see a victory here. The president says, well, if we've lost Cronkite, we've lost the war, which was really a strategic, basically, turning point for the war. War is a contest of will. We won every battle in Vietnam, but we lost the war because you lose the population who doesn't view the American interest there to fight a counterinsurgency for a government that's struggling for its own legitimacy. South Vietnam had many issues of corruption, things like that. So there's the complexity there, but something that interested me was the knowledge, right? So the IDF, the U.S. military, they are schools of thought from their beginning to their evolutions and way they think about things. I've talked many times to David Petraeus, who was really one of the warrior scholars, still is, who had to rail against the institution because after Vietnam, of course, the U.S. military is like, we never want this again, and just threw away their lessons from the history of counterinsurgency. And General Petraeus put together a team to really dust off the counterinsurgency theory and doctrine, which is kind of the way we do things. And he had to fight amazing uphill battles between the military to even say that there is history here that was where it worked, why it worked, what is it needed to work, and was the successful things like the surge and aspects of that. You're right on the urban aspect, though. It is I mean, urban warfare has always been here. Like we have a global history of really the reasons you have military is that you would send them out of your castle or out of your city state to go fight the army that was coming to besiege you so you didn't have to have a siege warfare. We've had the history of military are about cities, fighting for cities for many reasons, population growth. I mean, you don't have vast expanses of open areas to have battles anymore. I mean, you're going to hit a city. Where what are the the political objectives? Like you said, we have this Westphalian post World War II, very geopolitically connected world where cities are the economic engines, the political engines of nations under this global international order. So if there is going to be a war, and this is why, again, why I was so ready for the Ukraine wars, because if Russia wants to take a nation, you got to take its capital, you got to take its source of power, what we call center of gravity. So many elements of what you said are like, multi-hour
Of
conversations
course, of
in different
course.
directions.
And I appreciate that. I mean, there's no question that if given the opportunity, I would pick your brain for hours.
Yeah.
But at a certain point, we lose people and you lose income. There is a, I think one of the most useful things I can talk about because it's something that I'm actually part of, whereas I've never been part of any military organization, is the social media aspect of modern war. Because as Vietnam being this great paradigm for that, not only did we lose the Vietnamese population, we lost the domestic population. That took years. That took years. Yes, you use Walter Cronkite's unilateral surrender as a tipping point, but it was a multi-year process. Today, the disinformation starts not immediately. It's coordinated ahead of time. And in fact, we saw it with the United States government doing it, doing a deception almost as good as the first U.S. Army group. Level of high level deception on social media on the eve of the U.S. deployment of B-2 bombers over Iran. There's are obviously two battlefields, right? There's the battlefield, the one where you get killed or kill, and then there's the political battlefield. One thing I guess we still haven't learned, and tell me if I'm wrong, I'd love to hear that I am, is how to deal with, all right, the paradigm, I've used the word twice within one paragraph, of terror, of insurgency or terrorism is I have nothing to lose. I there and I'm outmatched. I have nothing to lose. You have institutions, you have infrastructure, and you value what you have more than highly. So therefore, I'm going to destroy those things. I'm going to give you the impression that I'm essentially desperate and that my life means nothing to me. And in the process, I'm going to also I'm going to use all kinds of campaigns, whether it's traditional media or social media, to undermine the political willpower for you to destroy me. Because if you were a dictatorship or a monarchy, you could destroy me just based on the scorecard and based just, yes, it's true. It doesn't always work. Look at how poorly the United Kingdom uh, executed its imperial military obligations in the 20th century. But all things being equal, we none of these troublemakers would stand a chance. So what do? They find allies. They establish allies and among American institutions. And all right, blah blah blah. This is, like I said, same playbook. I was a kid growing up and I saw this happening. It was so obvious to me. I was watching Walter Cronkite. have we learned anything about how to deal with that other than to some extent deploying it ourselves the way, I mean, I think what Trump and Netanyahu have done so far, if I can be forgiven, you're taking notes and scaring the hell out of me by the fact that you're taking notes, strikes me as more of a tactical than a strategic bluff, by which I mean they got cover for a major strategic operation. But as far as we know right now, and folks, we're recording this June 25th. Okay. I don't, by the time, but by the time this goes, I don't know what we're going to have learned. But as far as I know, they haven't really changed the big strategic picture of insurgency slash terrorism that I was referring to before. And Iran, I'm treating Iran as essentially an extension of Hamas. Fighting them is more like fighting a terrorist entity than the traditional state actors. My question is ridiculous. It's like I'm giving the lecture here and I don't know what I'm talking about. You see, but you see what I'm getting at, right?
No, they're all fascinating topics, and I love to help people, not you, but like audiences, try to work through them. I mean, I wrote a piece on like stop calling Hamas just terrorist, um, because in my world of when it gets to there's war. War is the pursuit of political goals. Some people say like war on drugs and things like that. From my perspective, when you're talking about the use of force by a nation state, declaring war, waging war, act of war, those all have important. Same thing for terrorism. Terrorism, the use of violence against civilians to invoke fear to achieve political goals. It's highly debated in academic circles, like just the definition of terrorism. Even non-state actor, right? So you have a which is unique when we're talking about Israel, is that you have some very unique cases of, okay, what is Hamas? It's a non-state actor. It's in an autonomous area. It's not an internationally armed conflict because it's not a nation. Palestine is not a nation. You talk about Iran though. Iran deploys proxy warfare, which you kind of mentioned, which is basically it's historical as well. A nation using proxies to achieve their goal, not fight that nation directly because it would be, an act of war, international armed conflict. The Cold War aspect of this from the, go watch Charlie Wilson's war, our use of terrorists to fight the Soviets in Afghanistan through the use of proxies, right? So there's so many nuances there to the terms and looking at it. When you talk about Iran, though, right? Because I do believe in the post-World War II global, international order, basically sovereign borders, when force can be used, when it cannot be used, wars of aggressions or war crimes, things like that, preemptive strikes, the Caroline Doctrine, things. Iran is a nation state, but also a terror, the biggest global exporter of terrorism through proxy warfare. Like acknowledged, doesn't deny it, does it, has a whole force called the Quds Force, whose only job is to do that. I wrote so many things down because there were just so many nuances of even what you call deception, right? So deception, military deception, one term. At the strategic level, though, you have a political leader kind of being involved because the world has changed. I'm not a historian where like a lot of my historian friends would be like, that's not new, et cetera. It's always, it was here, here, and here. And even when I do that, I'm like, I'm not a historian because you're right. The Cronkite moment is what we called it. Eventually it was called the CNN effect. Then it was called TikTok wars. And then it's evolved. Where you were watching TV on a nightly basis to get your information about Vietnam. It was on your TV every night. Now you have the social media aspect, which is an algorithm driving you to the most negative parts about war. And I argue because that cognitive warfare, right? That cognitive plane. Some people like other European armies sometimes will say like there's a physical domain and there's a cognitive domain. You're fighting for both in the warfare. That's not the way the US military kind of separates it. We call it information operations. It's part of all warfare. Where it comes into my world is the urban warfare. Like, why is it so hard there? Is one of the reasons is that the sensors, right? So every citizen has a cell phone. There's more cell phones than there are humans on the planet, right? So there's like five per person. in places all around the world. So the idea that you could have surprise, right? So this is where deception meets sensors, right? In the urban environments, as we have seen, right, where you there's so much open source intelligence, and the military is using it, and then go, like you send in a B-2 bomber, a stealth bomber, because there's somebody outside that base with a cell phone going, look, I just saw some B-2s headed this direction, right? So you have to get really inventive on your deception operations to achieve surprise in warfare. And same thing with Israel, even in after October 7th in Gaza. The other aspect is there's differences between deception, propaganda, information operations. There's like all these have different nuances. Influence operations is one of the terms that we use. So you're right that people like, Goebbels and Russian and Chinese saying, I can't defeat this power, the Western alliance, the American government directly, but I'll erode their civilizations through the use of their citizens who are collecting information, right? That's why it's such a danger if, Chinese government has access to all of our citizens' information on TikTok. Although that's a very influential app. So there's so many elements of this when it comes down to, for my world though, in the urban environment, why is it so hard to achieve a military goal? And you're right, in conjunction with the growth of urban warfare across the spectrum of conflict, right? Because you have, a Russian military force trying to take Kyiv and having a basically a whole of government defense is different than all of these non-state actors that have popped up around the world who can gain immense military advantages by getting inside of the urban area and using their population as a shield. It's called human shielding, using the laws of war against the actual legitimate fight for whatever the just reason is. So many aspects. Definitely the world has changed, and fighting a war has changed. As we just saw, this was this was two nations fighting a war, just like we have Ukraine, Russia. But then you have Israel engaged in 7 wars, some of them with non-state actors, which are proxies to the Iranian Islamic regime. But when you look at it from the nuances of the context, is no, that's a what we consider a non-internationally armed conflict because it's a non-state actor. The proxy element, it's acknowledged, but there's also all these nuances to definitions, laws, everything.
But these are real things. And a lot of people on social media, God bless them, tend to dismiss, well, there's really no war. Or you hear things like the victors write the history books as if, there is a slide towards nihilism. Nothing matters and there is no truth and everything's a false flag. I mean, there are all these new tropes that everyone now is an expert on false flags and deception, again, deception. The amazing thing is that to me, the it, the Israeli political scene is every bit as vicious and aggressive as anything you see in the United States. In fact, I maintain that the Democrats, and I'm not pinning my partisanship on you, that the Democrats in the United States learned criminalization of political dissent from the Israelis who've been prosecuting criminal political threats since the 50s. They, on the other hand, when it came to the operation that they laid out beginning in mid-June against the Iranians, the multiple levels of planning and execution, infiltration, that's one that I mean that's that's one they're going to teach in the war colleges for quite some time to come, I assume.
Which part? The
All of it. I mean, just the fact that notwithstanding what we were talking about, which is that democracies have this vulnerability
Yes,
that non-democracies have less of.
that's
It's a
right.
fallacy to say
Absolutely.
they don't have it, uh, but they have much less of. And Israel is a very noisy and very, there are many, many things on which they do not agree, but they got their act together in executing this operation against Iran in such a phenomenal way. It's there seems to be a special sauce here that we didn't know existed.
Absolutely. And you're right. This will be taught in war colleges around the world for a very long time. Many elements of it, from the operational level, which is, what we say is kind of the theater level, like this operation, down to the tactical, like the use of the low tech and deep intelligence infiltration, drones, all of this, to that political level. Because I agree, like when I can see something that what right looks like, right? We're not in a world where you can't communicate, right? Israel has struggled in communicating, right? So, Times of Israel chief editor says Israel is not bad at PR. Israel doesn't do PR. As an editor, he's like, we want information. In this sense, though, on communicating the objectives daily, on giving updates of the war daily, what's happening, what are you doing, um, in the ubiquitous instant information world that we live in, that's the level of communication that has to be done during a war, not just for your population, which is critical, but for all populations. And you saw that. So, although this is just 12 days, and I believe the ceasefire will hold 12 days, it was that level of information. You had multimedia presentations. I mean, it was amazing. And that's really important going forward, because if you're not telling the story, other people are, right? So why did you do this? What's the goal, right? How many times the political leaders had to say, this is not about regime change. Regime change happens, but that's not the goal. And that was so important, especially with the United States, but I think in Israel as well. Now if you transfer that though to, like, why weren't you doing it in other areas? I have learned, and one of the books I want to write is the Israeli standard. I've been studying war. Like, I'll be in India next week. I was in Ukraine, Azerbaijan, you name it. There's something very unique to the what the world thinks is allowed, or what they think Israel's hidden agendas are. The standards of, like, rules of war that only are applicable to Israel. And this is again why I've been so vocal, not just because it's the right thing to do, because I had the information, and like your thing says about knowledge. I believe with great knowledge comes great responsibility, and I had a responsibility to communicate, to identify, like, look, what you just said, like the question of what's your civilian to combatant ratio, which I fought back again as one, like, if we're going to do this, lies, damn lies, and statistics, let's be truthful about any comparable example. But that's never been a question to any nation in any war ever. And you know why? Because it's
Say
fraught
that
with.
again, John. Say it again. Say that again, because that's something that never even occurred to me. Say it again.
The question of what is your civilian to combatant ratio has never been asked of any nation in any war in history. And there are so many. We could do a whole podcast about why. Why is it? Because the idea that you could have a casualty count in the moment, the idea that who is the person saying that was a combatant or that is a non-combatant, because in my world there's no civilians. There's either you're a part of the fight, you're a named member of an organization, or you're partaking in the fight. And there are many ways to partake in hostilities, like holding hostages, providing intelligence, bringing there's lots of reasons. But the ideal that anybody in a modern war could go point at a body and go, that was a non-combatant innocent civilian, is anti, basically intellectual. And that wouldn't mean just legal, moral, anything. If you have to understand the law of proportionality, like all these things, it's just never been asked, because it's not the question that needs to be asked. The question is, has, whatever, if we're using Israel, has Israel followed the laws of war, taken all precautions to protect civilians, like all these things? And the answer is overwhelmingly yes. So when that wasn't working, I think the Hamas and their backers saw that numbers were working. So they just doubled down on the number, right? So the actual terrorist organization started putting out numbers daily that has been viewed as highly questionable, and I've thought that route. But like I try to give other people comparisons because everybody wants this is a mental model. Like how does this compare? Like John, 10,000 or 50,000, this or that or whatever. Then I can run the numbers because I study war for a living, right? So the one example post World War II that I like to give people is like Korean War, right? Most people view it as a just war, fought for real reasons. If they want to get into the specifics, they can. But there were 2 million civilians that died during that war. It was a 37-month war. That would be 54,000 civilians a month dying every month of the war. But nobody was saying, well, that means you have to. That's a genocide. That means you're doing things illegal. That's an unjust. Like all these things. Like that's not the way that any of this works, right? War is hell. War is death and destruction. And we have evolved as societies, and I fight these groups as well, the anti-war groups. We have evolved as society. We don't do things that we used to in like World War II. We would bomb civilian populations and military targets, but trying to convince them to give up the war goals and all these things. We had the Geneva Conventions and like all these things, customary law, all these things. The number one thing you don't do though is the primary what we call fundamentals of the laws of war, which are meant to put limits on the brutality of war. It isn't meant to make war illegal. Like you can never target a civilian, period, a non-combatant. Like you're not like that's been like a universally accepted. But since October 7th, and this is why I've been so vocal because if they're saying all these things about this is the way that war has to be, like your civilian to combatant ratio has to be this, like you're taking away even democracies because we do have an issue with some nation states that just said like I don't care about the laws of war. I have a nuclear weapon. What are you going to do to me? Those you have that conversation, but you have democracies like Israel and what they were saying about the United States who are following the laws of war against combatants who are using the law of war against the world. And to say that
But
they can't defend themselves would be insane. That's the level we were going towards.
and it's interesting that you're. This is another example of asymmetric, you know, tactics. You use the past tense. That's the level we were going toward. Do you think we averted getting to that point?
Yes, I do. So, and this is will be the book that I wanted to write, right? I wanted to write the Israeli standard, right? Show all the tactics that were used, and until I had a framework, and I sat down with Natan Sharansky, you probably know, read his book talking about the past, right? To talk about groups like Amnesty International during past wars, like Gaza 2008, Gaza 2014. I mean, the tactics used to vilify the Israeli state. Number one, create a double standard. Number two, try to delegitimize the entire nation, and then you demonize. It gave me a framework to see like the craziness that I was seeing, but all the influencers, all this stuff. A lot of times, I'm like, okay, you haven't had success. Israel has still been successful, but when you started having nation states that should know better, believing Hamas numbers, um, putting sanctions on Israel, like weapon sanctions, not
And
delivering.
these are countries you must know. We're not talking
That's right.
about
That's right.
Botswana. We're talking about Ireland, Spain, France.
I mean, United States started believing because war is politics. It was an election year. United States started to go down that road of like, well, yeah, you can't use big bombs in urban areas, right? And I had known for where that was coming from, and you saw constraint put on Israel again. I can't find any parallels where, look, I know you need to go attack that enemy, but you can't use two divisions. I want you to use one division. This is the insanity, right? You can't go to Rafah where the leader of the terrorist organization we all recognize as the terrorist or where the hostages are. You can't go where the 100 tunnels that are flowing resupply into the combatant. You can't go there. This level had peaked to like though it was working. You saw a change in administration. I don't do politics at all, but I will say like look, recognizable fact on who was believing or pushing the kind of political lies about war, about just, about who's following the laws of war. The whole genocide, baseless, ridiculous claims, the starvation claims, like all
This
this.
the cynicism. I mean, here's the thing: it's hard to believe that these European leaders and certain members of American political class really ceased to operate cognitively. And all of a sudden, I mean, this idea of taking the word genocide,
Mm,
which became popular only because of the genocide of the Jews in World War II, not because there weren't genocides before that, but that was the one that got the world's attention. It happened in World War II. It was gigantic. It changed the entire nature, et cetera, et cetera. There was uh, a wholesale appropriation. It was a
yes.
wholesale appropriation for purely propaganda purposes by the left, which had somehow found common cause with the Palestinians. And I don't have to tell you all the comments you get from what appear to be European people and American people, although many of them just turn out to be Pakistani people or computers, using this term and desensitizing us to this term. Do you get the sense that in military, I mean, is that part of military, is dealing with that part of military planning, or is that something that only the political cadres can and should deal with, in your opinion?
It's definitely political. War is political. The politicalization, though, of warfare. I mean, this is one of the other reasons why I think I was uniquely just in the door, is because not only do I study urban warfare, but because urban warfare is where the most constraint on the use of force is, right? All the laws of war, if you look at them, they're going to apply at most because they're about protecting civilians, those not involved, so they don't pay the cost or the of the war, right?
Of all the big lies
Yeah,
that Goebbels told when he added a zero
that's right.
to the estimated body count in Dresden
Yeah,
and said instead of the 25,000 base, which was what the reporting he had available to him suggested, which was actually probably on the high side, but said no. So what we're going to publish is 250,000. It was exactly for the reason you just said, because that was a great way to get people who cared, and in those days, not as many people cared, but people who cared to say, wait, there's something wrong here. Little did he
yeah.
know how effective that would be 75 years later.
And I wouldn't know that a little book that I was assigned in my master's program would come to forever be helpful. It's a book called Lies, Damn Lies, and Statistics. It's about, but for actually for social reasons, not, it doesn't even go into the war aspect, but it applies about, you basically, you have a position, you want to sell it, make the number as big as you can, and just keep rising the number, and to say something's an issue, and the way you say it, the way you word it, everything. It's an amazing book. And I tell the story of Dresden often. I actually just told it recently because it has become a great example, as in most people, like Bernie Sanders was saying, the bombing's worse than Dresden, right? He doesn't know the story of that you just talked about, where Goebbels' own agency of propaganda, I think that's what it was called, put out that number. And then for 50 years, that was the number. Because you don't have the way to know if it's not the number, right? It wasn't until the wall fell, until there's some German scientists, and then there was a whole commission, that it went from, for 50 years, it was 250,000. They went down to 25,000. And that's so this is a point for me to, that you think that you can know what the number is right now, that you just magically, and it's incredible that people believe that the Gaza Health Ministry that's run by Hamas, uh, that nothing comes out of, when you have a, again, with another Sharansky paradigm, the way they talk about things, when you have a fear society where it doesn't matter if you don't agree with the leadership, but out of fear, you're not going to say anything against it publicly. So the same thing for the Gaza Health Ministry. There's no number that's going to come out. There's no talking that's going to come out without the threat of loss of life, of your life, if you do say something. The idea that you could have a number, again, because I do urban warfare, but I also have been dealing with these anti-war people who play in the numbers. They play in the laws. They tell people what the laws of war are, and lie about them. Like Amnesty International came out with a report about Ukraine saying it was illegal for the Ukrainian defenders to be in the cities they were defending because it was putting the cities at risk. And they published that. And it was like, what are you talking about? Um, but there's so many categories here that have, because it's Israel, have joined up and formed this circle of lies and used every line like the genocide convention. So they don't care what the definition is. They don't care. They just have a number, and that equals genocide to people, despite the definition of intent and acts that have to be there, and then the process to determine it. Right. So this is when they weaponize the political theater that is the United Nations and the ICJ and the ICC.
So, to kind of finish off, it would seem to me that the ingredient this, that absolutely makes the current kinetic war that we've been talking about so unique is anti-Semitism. I mean, I think there's a willingness to believe things that no one would believe, or to at least pretend to believe things that no one would believe, because the state involved is the
Yes.
Jewish state.
Absolutely.
And
So I can point to the Iraq War, which I was a part of, where the same organizations, like the Office of the High Commission of Human Rights, Amnesty International, Air Wars, said awful things about American military. Said that we did war crimes in Fallujah, things like that. But the underpinning of anti-Semitism, John Spencer's opinion, it didn't spread around the world as rapidly as anything that's said about Israel or the IDF, or it wasn't weaponized in the halls of the United Nations as quickly as it has been. And this is again going back to this Israeli standard in war, which goes, I mean, even the fact that Israel's never been able to win a war at some point, and this is what the Hamas strategy was, to know that eventually the international community could be convinced, this time through lies, through social media, and convincing people of things to join without even knowing it, that they're fighting for the terrorist, and get the international community to come in and go and stop Israel, like the Yom Kippur War, the 6 Day, like all of them,
like
where
all of them.
all of them, and say, look, I know you're defending yourself, but you have to stop. In this case, that was very close. I think it was a very big threat that was going to happen. And luckily, there was a change of administration. There was a change of the environment, and Israel, who was following the laws of war, and everybody who I've ever known who's gone to Gaza, whether it's a four-star general or somebody who just knows about war, they also say, like, yeah, Israel's doing more than anybody's ever else done, and they're continuing the operation. So as of right now, Israel is continuing to move towards their goal in like in Gaza.
I mean, there are a lot of accusations today, though, that that's exactly what Trump just did with Iran. I don't know if I think again the hot takes are almost always wrong, but on the other hand, I've been accused more than once of being a trust the plan guy, so I'm a little bit, leery. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, it's hard. Every war has its own, we say, yeah, I use all this military theory, its own lexicon, its own context, its own everything.
I thought they were all the Iraq War. I'm sorry. I thought
That's
Iraq
right.
was the
That's
only
right.
war that was ever fought,
You
although
would
I'm old
think.
enough to remember when Vietnam syndrome was the thing. Okay, but fine.
Yeah. So we this one will be studied because it is so unique. Even what Israel did in the opening preemptive strike, it's just never been done before. So there is some stuff.
It
While
may
you're right though, that there are some things that are never changed, right? The misinformation and everything, it just has there's a new spin to it.
we we could go on forever. So I'm not going to do that, as I promised. Understanding urban warfare is pretty much the heart of John Spencer's scholarship right now. It's his book from 2021, if I'm correct.
Yep.
Connected Soldiers, a more recent and fascinating. We're not talking about that so much, but it's a fascinating concept. The idea that connectivity with home, all those classic war stories and grunt stories about getting those letters from home. It's a whole new world. How that affects morale, how that affects uh, uh, tactics, how that affects the politics. This is John Spencer's website, okay? JohnSpencerOnline.com. Here's his podcast, the Modern War Institute podcast. This is an interesting guy. But guess what? He's really interested in truth. And that's why he's on this program. Thank you for culminating with us, John. It's been great talking to you.
Thank you so much. It was a great pleasure.